This is the Urban Connection, the weekly show on issues that affect the community.
This week, we have the compelling story of a man wrongfully convicted of murdering his wife. He survived years in prison, but emerged with an inspirational story.
Never give up. Never give up. If someone tells you you're guilty of a crime and you haven't done it, it's important that you never accept any agreement or any deal with a prosecutor because it's going to hurt you in the long run.
That's straight ahead here on the Urban Connection.
Now, the Urban Connection continues. Once again, here's Leonard Birdsong.
Hello, folks. I have an interesting guest today. He's a fellow who has lived between the United States and Canada, but he's an American citizen. He was convicted of a crime he didn't commit. It was the murder of his wife. And unfortunately, he spent 3+ years in a Canadian prison. I met him a few weeks ago, and I know that he wanted to get some publicity about his case. And he said, "Do you know anything about law and prisons and jails?" And I said, "I know a lot about it because I was a federal prosecutor in Washington, D.C. His name is Demetrios Angelis, and I want to thank you for being with me.
Well, thank you for having me, Leonard.
I was anxious to get you on. You have such a compelling story. Over 3 years in a Canadian prison.
That's right.
You were convicted, a bad conviction, for killing or murdering your wife. That was not true. The conviction was overturned several years later. And now Hollywood wants to make a movie about you. Isn't that right?
That's right. I actually have a meeting planned later this evening with my screenwriter.
Okay. You have a Greek name, Demetrios Angelis, I think it is the way it's pronounced. Right. Your family is of a number of origins, but you consider yourself an African American, is that right?
Yes. I've done a recent DNA test, and there's a considered amount of interesting results that came out. My father is part South African, and my mother is part from the region of Cameroon.
Yep. Mm-hmm.
So there's a significant tie to Africans. And when people look at me, they do see something there that's not entirely, Caucasian. In fact, I was in JFK Airport 2 days ago and encountered discrimination at the screening with TSA to board the plane. And they held me for 20 minutes to the point where I missed my flight.
Boy, oh boy.
And because they thought I was Arabic or Muslim from either the Middle East or Northern Africa or something to that sort. So I still experience racism till this day.
I'm sure that you do, and I'm sorry to hear about that. Let's talk a little bit about your background. I understand that your mother wanted you to live in Montreal, and you did go there, and you got a good university education. You got 2 bachelor's degrees and 2 master's degrees, and you work for the Ottawa government for some time. Is that right?
Yes, that's correct. Yes, for the Public Health Department.
And you are highly thought of from what I can gather.
Well, I've developed a good reputation. I mean, in addition to doing work across the country in Canada, I have a good reputation of being a loyal government public servant, but also an accomplished writer.
Well, that's great. Now, let me go on to the bad things that happened. We will focus now on June 8th, 2008. Can you tell us what happened?
Well, on June 8th, 2008, it was exactly 1 month before we were scheduled to go to court, my wife and I, to go start the divorce process in court. And we had arrived at the conclusion that we're going to divorce because she didn't want to go to marriage counseling. And when I brought her in front of our priest's office about several weeks before, he had pretty much told us we either had to go to marriage counseling to solve the marriage issues between us or go to court for divorce. Now, the reason why I was filing for divorce was because she had an extramarital affair, and she had attempted to actually kidnap our younger son to leave the country. And I had stopped her with the help of the police marginally, but nothing more was done to sort of ensure that nothing like this would happen again. And so I had to take matters into my own hand by bringing her to the priest. We tried to resolve it peacefully. She didn't want to go to marriage counseling or end her extramarital affair. And so we were scheduled to go to court to start the divorce process on July the 8th. Mm-hmm. Now, she did not respond very well to that. And in fact, she became increasingly anxious and scared for fear of losing custody of our 2 children, our 3-year-old son and our 8-year-old daughter, but also half of the marital assets. And so she became increasingly violent and even abusive towards us. And we were unable to get a restraining order to keep her away or even get her out of the house because her name was also on the lease. So we were stuck there until we had a judge in the divorce court order her to leave. So as we get closer and closer to the actual divorce court date, like I said, she became increasingly abusive and started being violent with our daughter and with me in particular. And on June the 8th of 2008 is when she had attacked me out of frustration, leaving me with a black eye, busted lip, bleeding genitals. And as I tried to restrain her, she had actually went into cardiac arrest. At the time, I didn't know what was happening. And in fact, even after she had passed away, the pathologist wasn't sure how she died because the results came back as inconclusive. I was arrested and charged with murder and ordered to go to trial.
You were the one that called 911, though, after she dropped dead. Isn't that right?
That's right. I did. It took me a while because I was in shock.
But the police arrested you for murder on the spot. At least they charged you with murder. Isn't that right?
That's right. They did.
And you say that some of this had to do with the biases that Canadians have. Isn't that right? Tell us about that.
Yes. Well, although they will never admit it, Canadians are very biased against people that are not of British or French descent. And so if you are of another culture or another ethnicity, they tend to treat you differently. If people who are aware of what happened a few weeks ago with the current Prime Minister of Canada, he was caught 3 times in photographs dressed as blackface. And what I found interesting is when they did a survey of that, 60% of people in Canada didn't consider that to be any sign or any indication of racism. And that's funny because a similar event happened with the governor of Virginia.
That's exactly right.
Governor Ralph Northam. And he was caught in a photograph with blackface, and there were public outcries for his resignation. But still, people forgave him, and they decided to give him a chance to finish his term, to sort of redeem himself, improve himself by improving the lives of African Americans in the state of Virginia. Whether or not that happens here in Canada remains to be seen.
The majority, you say, the majority Caucasian population in Canada would like everyone to believe that racism does not exist in their country.
That's right.
You don't believe that, do you?
No, I don't. I can tell you from my experience in jail that the majority of the population in Canadian prisons are of a non-Caucasian origin.
Before we get to that, let me talk about what happened at your first trial. Can you tell us the composition of the jurors and what you felt about them?
Well, the jurors were made of 12 people, 8 women and 4 older men, and they were all white. They were all Caucasians. And not only that, but the majority of them were not even of my generation. And so, you know, my experience and my knowledge is the older the generation in Canada, the less tolerant they are of visible or ethnic minorities.
Mm-hmm. Do you think some of them felt that you had basically gamed the system, that you got certain things that were high-paying jobs and things like that that native Canadians should have gotten?
That's right. The mentality in Canada is that if you're a ethnic or visible minority and you end up with a high education, lots of degrees and diplomas, and a high-paying job, you should not have gotten that because there are others from the majority population who should have gotten those jobs, and they didn't. So there's a bit of resentment.
But they didn't get the education that you had. That's the whole thing.
Yes.
You outdid them.
That's right. And generally speaking, any immigrants and the children of immigrants recognize right away that the only way to succeed in this country is by striving for a higher education.
Mm-hmm. But then when people get it, they don't like you.
That's right. There's a bit of resentment and jealousy behind it, yes.
But let's go back to the trial. As I understand it, on October 30th of 2010, the jury came back with a guilty verdict. What was the sentence?
So I was sentenced to life in prison with no eligibility for parole for at least, the jury recommended 10 years, but because the prosecutor argued that this was a typical case of domestic violence, that I at least had to have an extra 2 years. So I would have 12 years of being in prison without being eligible for parole. But ultimately, I was sentenced to life in prison, and the parole board would decide whether or not I was eligible after 12 years to be released. Otherwise, I would stay in there a lot longer. And so I was sent to the federal penitentiary. It is pretty much the Canadian Alcatraz, and that's where the worst of the worst criminals end up going. You have terrorists, you have serial killers, you have child rapists and molesters, you have professional organized criminals, It's just the bottom of the bottom. That's where the worst criminals in the country end up going. So this is where I stayed for almost 4 years until I was able to file an appeal.
Right. Well, how did you protect yourself in prison? Did you protect yourself in prison?
Well, the one thing I learned was to stay quiet and keep to myself and avoid any invitation by organized gang members and also the terrorist groups, which tend to be radical Islamists. And so I stayed to myself, but at the same time, I respected everybody and treated them as if they were decent human beings. And I had developed a reputation for being a father-like figure. A lot of these boys, or even these guys, did not have any fathers in their life, and so I was sort of considered their father. And that way I was able to avoid having any encounters with the guys there who tended to be violent.
Yeah.
I mean, I did still manage to get assaulted once for looking at somebody the wrong way, but other than that, I never got assaulted or got into any trouble of any kind.
Demetrios, hang on. We're going to take a quick break and return for more of your story. We're back with more in a moment here on The Urban Connection.
More of The Urban Connection straight ahead. Stay tuned. Now back to The Urban Connection. Here's your host, Leonard Birdsong.
We're back with Demetrios Angelis, who was wrongfully convicted of murdering his wife and spent years in a Canadian prison. So, to pick up the story, you were imprisoned while awaiting trial. Let's talk about bail in Canada, because it's different than the United States. I understand you had to wait a long time before you could get a bail hearing. Isn't that right?
Oh, yes. Canada has one of the worst and toughest bail practices and conditions. It took me 8 months to be released on bail. So meanwhile, I am detained in an overcrowded prison cell designed for 2 inmates. But usually we had 3 inmates and occasionally 4. And we didn't have a window. And if you were considered the bottom of the bottom, meaning someone who killed a woman or killed a child or did harm to a woman or a child, you were kept in a place where you were locked up almost 24 hours a day, 7 days a week.
That's a shame.
We were only let out 3 times a week for showers. And when they did the spot checks in the prison cells, they would bring us out to the prison yard, usually on a rainy or cold or snowy day, while they searched our cells for contraband.
So let's go to the second trial. How did you get to the second trial, and how much did it cost you?
Well, fortunately, I found 2 lawyers who were ready to take on my case to the Court of Appeal, and the Court of Appeal overturned the conviction. It took them about 2 years, but about a little over 2 years, but they managed to convince at least 2 of the 3 judges that I was wrongfully convicted, and that I needed to have, and I didn't get a fair trial. So at the very least, grant me a retrial. And so the 2 of the 3 judges agreed, and then I was immediately had the conviction overturned. But then I had to go back and wait to get bail again to be released before I started my retrial. So now for the retrial, we sort of went a different approach from the first trial. The first trial, my first set of lawyers were unsuccessful in submitting all the evidence. And so there was a lot of pieces of the puzzles that were missing. And so the prosecutor took advantage of that to get her first conviction. The second time around, I had a better set of lawyers, defense attorneys, who fought to put most, if not all of it back, most of the evidence back during the second trial, and to the point where the jury had no choice to acquit me. I mean, and this time around, though, the jurors were 8 men and 4 women. Again, they were all Caucasians. I was unable to get any visible minority, but at least we had 8 men and 4 women, and they were closer to my age group than the first trial.
All right, that's good. But now let's talk about the forensics. As I understand it, there was some pathology to indicate that you could not have murdered your wife, that she had a condition that led to her death. Can you tell us about that? Yes,
well, as I said before, the pathology report came back inconclusive. And that was because there was one thing the pathologist didn't think of testing, and it was because my wife was of Southeast Asian descent in her 40s, and there's a rare condition among that group called the Brugada syndrome. And the Brugada syndrome is essentially when the electrical system in the heart stops working, it malfunctions, and it causes the heart to go into cardiac arrest.
Mm-hmm.
But it never appears in the pathology report as a heart attack. And so when it comes back as inconclusive, everybody's left speculation as to what happened. For me personally, I found it very bizarre that although it was my blood all over the apartment and all over her body, they still didn't see it as self-defense, and they didn't see it as a heart attack that happened while I was trying to restrain her. And so it took strong grilling by my two lawyers to sort of challenge the results and force the pathologist to agree that, yes, this could very well have been Buchanan's syndrome, but there was no way of knowing 100% because of the fact that the family, my in-laws, had cremated the body.
So the government could not prove that you were murdered beyond a reasonable doubt. That's what it comes down to. I guess they call it the shadow of a doubt in England and Canada.
That's right.
Let's change horses here and talk a little bit about prisons in Canada and the United States. I have some information here that the majority of male prisoners in Canada, at 25%, are native indigenous people.
That's right.
Yet they make up only 5% of the overall Canadian population. 25% of the people in prison in Canada are of native or indigenous descent. Yet they make up only 5% of the overall Canadian population. The second largest group, 8.6, are African or people of African descent, and that's growing. And that you say that only 3% of the overall prison people are Africans or of African descent. And are these true statistics as you know them?
Yes, I've done the research, and I will confirm that the second largest population in prisons at 8.6% are those of African descent. And that number is growing at a rate of 90% every 10 years. Yet the African Canadian population only makes up 3% of the overall population in the country. So you have almost 3 times the number of people in prison are African, yet and of African descent. But in the general population, they only make up 3% of the population.
Yeah, well, that's sort of the way the United States is. In the United States, 37% of the male population is of African descent, followed by whites at 32% and Hispanics at 22%.
Yeah.
In the state where I live, in Florida, 49% of the prison population of the state are African Americans and 38% white and only 13% Hispanic. There is definitely bias in the criminal justice system, both in Canada and in the United States. Would you agree with me on that?
Oh, yes, that is exactly correct. Yes, I agree with you 100%.
And so even though you've lived in both the United States, I forgot to tell people that before your mother moved everyone back to Montreal, you lived in upper state New York, where you live now, right?
Yes, I do.
All right. So you also went on to tell me some information I didn't know, that a lot of prisoners in Canada are innocent. Can you give us some statistics on that?
Yes, well, in Canada, 1% of the prison population are innocent. And what happened is, on average, every year we have 872 people that are wrongfully convicted. But once they realize that these people have been wrongfully convicted, only 163 of the 872 people are compensated, whereas the remainders are pretty much given released without an apology or any financial compensation.
So what happened to you? That's what I wanted to know. You were one of the ones who didn't get compensated.
I was never given an apology, and I was never compensated for the troubles and all the losses that my family and I endured. Never.
Yeah, I didn't want to go deep into how much you spent, but as I understand it, you and your family spent several $1,000s trying to get you off from this bogus conviction.
Yes.
A lot of money.
Yes.
So, again, you've been through the tough times. I'm so sorry to hear about this. But you finally were able to get some insurance money, and you've started your life again. Is that right?
Yes. So what I ended up was, because I was not wrongfully implicated in the death of my wife, I was legally entitled to her life insurance, which I used to pay off all the debt that my parents and I endured. I mean, my parents ended up selling their home, and we all went into debt to pay our legal fees, and then we were literally bankrupt. But thankfully, the life insurance money was enough to cover all the debt, And not only that, my employer ultimately agreed to give me a settlement. They did not want me to come back to work for them because I was still considered a hot political potato.
That's a shame.
But they agreed to give me 3 years' worth of salary. And with that 3 years worth of salary, I decided I was going to invest it in rental property and go into the rental property business, but more specifically, purchasing historic homes that were converted to rental property and flipping it. And so that's how I make my living now.
I understand that, but let's be clear. You got out of Canada, though, didn't you?
I had to, because there was no future for me in Canada.
Yeah, that's a shame. Well, let's tell the listeners, how did Hollywood come knocking on this? It's great that they are going to make a movie about all of this. Tell us about it.
Well, I had written a book about my, tragedy and my family's tragedy. And I went to several comic book conventions where you have a lot of celebrities come who used to play heroes and villains in TVs and movies. And I had approached them and told them my story. And next thing you know, people just started giving me their phone numbers and emails, and they were very compassionate about what I went through, my family went through, the loss of my children, which were put up for adoption, and who I can't see until they become adults next year. And a lot of people really, I had some people actually wipe tears from their face. And then they sort of referred me to others who would be interested in my story. And next thing I knew, people were coming and saying this would be a great movie, not only to entertain people, but also to educate people as to what's still going on in the world.
Right.
Especially a country like Canada, where people think that it's such a wonderful country, but it's not. It has the same problems as the United States, and some might even consider it worse. But yes, the next thing I knew, I have screenwriters coming in and volunteering to write the screenplay. I have a bunch of people waiting to see the results of the screenplay, and ready to come on board to finance the movie and hire big name actors and share the story with the world.
Well, that's great. That's really great.
There's a couple of actors in particular. One is Robert Patrick, who played the bad guy in Terminator 2. And when he heard about what happened to me, in particular the judge who sentenced me to go to trial, he found it particularly outrageous and says, he likes to play bad characters on film, and he would love to play the judge that sends me to trial for murder. And so, and because this was a very outrageous judge, known for making decisions based on people's race.
Mm-hmm.
And you would not expect that in the 21st century, but it does happen.
It certainly does happen. Well, what is the name of your book? It's coming out soon, I understand.
That's right. It's called The Ottawa Way. Ottawa is the capital of Canada, so it's called The Ottawa Way, Viral Outbreak in Canada's Capital. And it's coming out in early 2020, and hopefully the movie comes out around 2021. So that's the plan for that.
Well, we will be looking for it. We really will. Demetrios, I'm glad that you could come on with me. It's an awful story, something that most people don't want to go through. I certainly wouldn't want to go through it myself, but you seem resilient and not resentful, and you're moving on with your life. That's a beautiful thing. Well,
in order to overcome such tragedies, you have to have resilience, you have to have patience, you have to have perseverance, hope, optimism, religious faith, and through hard work, you can overcome everything. And my message to your listeners is never give up. Never give up. If someone tells you you're guilty of a crime and you haven't done it, it's important that you never accept any agreement or any deal with the prosecutor, because it's going to hurt you in the long run. If you're innocent, then you have to insist that you are going to stand your ground and claim your innocence.
That's good advice. Well, Demetrios, Angelis, we are out of time, but I want to thank you for sharing your story with us today.
Well, thank you, Leonard, and I hope to be in touch with you soon.
And we hope you'll be back to join us again next week for another edition of The Urban Connection.
That wraps up this episode of The Urban Connection with your host, Leonard Birdsong, a production of Syndication Networks of Chicago. Thanks for listening, and join us next time for another edition of The Urban Connection.